The Bolen Parque gang is a Hispanic street gang that started in the 1960s. Back then they ran Baldwin Park until they eventually split into two groups, Eastside and Northside. The name itself, Bolen Parque, actually came from another Hispanic gang that mispronounced Baldwin Park, and it just stuck. By the early 90s, Joseph Conrad Flores was an active member of Eastside Bolen Parque, who everyone knew by street name, Jojo. Oswaldo Amezcua was also an active member of the Eastside Bolen Parque, and he went by Wizard. Both Joseph and Oswaldo were considered veteranos, very respected guys who had already put in work for the gang. Just after midnight, on April 11, 2000, Paul Gonzalez and his half-brother, John Diaz, were riding down Merced Street in Baldwin Park on a bicycle. They just stopped at the Circle K Market. John was part of the Monrovia gang, but Paul wasn't involved in gangs at all. As they were heading back home, Paul pedaled through a green light passing right in front of a black SUV that was waiting at an intersection. Inside the SUV were Joseph and Oswaldo. At first the SUV just drove past them, but then it suddenly made a U-turn and started trailing them. As the SUV got closer, Paul could see two people inside. Then, the passenger leaned out and shouted, "Where you from?" Before Paul could answer, someone inside started shooting. John was hit 3 times, in his side, back, and buttocks, which shattered his bladder. Paul ditched the bike and dove behind a parked car for cover. When the SUV sped off, he looked up and saw John stumbling toward him saying, "Call an ambulance, fool." A moment later, John collapsed in the middle of the street. Paul ran to him, slid a sweatshirt under his head and screamed for help while trying to comfort his brother. Detective Ernie Colasso was actually sitting in his car right outside that Circle K and heard the gunshots, but he couldn't find where they were coming from. Then, a radio call came in about a shooting victim down on Merced Avenue. Detective Colasso then pulled up and found John lying in the street, barely alive. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but John didn't make it. He was pronounced dead not long after. 9mm shell casings were scattered on the street, and there was a bullet hole in a nearby house. At John's autopsy, detectives pulled a bullet from his body and collected it as evidence. Paul gave police a description of the shooter and identified Joseph Conrad Flores as the man who killed his brother. On the night of May 25, 2000, Arturo Madreal was just trying to park his Chevy Blazer in Eastside Bolen Parque's territory. Sitting in the car with him was his friend, Fernando Gutierrez. Another car rolled up beside them on the driver's side. Inside were about 4 young Hispanic men, early 20s, all with shaved heads. Among them were Joseph and Oswaldo. One of them leaned out the window and asked Arturo where he was from. Neither Arturo nor Fernando had anything to do with gangs. Arturo said, "We're not from nowhere." Almost immediately, one of the men pulled the gun. Fernando saw the flash ducked under the dashboard and then heard gunshots. When the gunshots finally stopped, he could hear blood dripping next to him. Arturo was hit. Fernando jumped out of the Blazer and scrambled to call for help. When detectives arrived, they saw Arturo slumped in the driver's seat and blood pouring from his head and ears. He was already gone. He was shot through the left side of the head, and the bullet severed his brainstem, causing severe brain injury. He also had a graze wound on his knee. Detectives recovered 4 expended 9mm Luger shell casings and 2 spent bullets near the Blazer, plus another bullet lodged inside the driver's side door panel. The coroner later pulled a 9mm round from his wound. All the casings came from the same gun, and the bullets were consistent with being fired from a 9mm Smith & Wesson semi-automatic pistol. Detectives believe that Arturo was targeted because he had a shaved head and tattoos, which made him look like a rival gang member. In the morning hours of June 7, 2000, Catherine Schaefer stopped by her friend Paul Ponce's house on Cobblestone Drive in Victorville. Paul, who was known on the streets as Vago, was a member of the Eastside Bolen Parque gang. Around 4:47 a.m., he and Catherine were in the garage doing laundry, while another friend, Steve Villa, was inside the house using the bathroom. Someone then knocked on the front door. The home had CCTV, and on the monitor in the garage, Catherine could see a car parked outside that she didn't recognize. Paul went to check it out, and seconds later, there were gunshots. After the shooting stopped, she found Paul lying on the living room floor, riddled with bullets, and not breathing. She grabbed the phone and called 911. San Bernardino County Sheriff's detectives arrived within minutes. Inside the house, they found spent 9mm and .22 caliber shell casings scattered around, and .22 caliber birdshot pellets lodged in the living room walls. They also found small amounts of meth and cocaine, and 2 loaded guns in the front room. The autopsy showed that Paul was shot 14 times, and those shots were fired in quick succession. Gunpowder burns near his ears showed 1 shot had been fired from about a foot or less away. The forensic pathologist concluded Paul would have died within just 2 or 3 minutes of being shot. Inside his body, 3 different kinds of ammunition were recovered, meaning that there was probably more than 1 gunman, possibly even 3. 2 weeks after the murder, Joseph opened up to a friend named Katrina Barber. He told her that his own mother already knew he killed his homeboy Vago. He said that the reason he killed him was that Paul was making a lot of money selling drugs, but he wasn't kicking anything back to Eastside Bolen Parque. On top of that, he was bragging about how much money he made and that he was refusing to put in work for the gang. Joseph and Oswaldo actually showed up at Paul's wake. They walked up to his casket, then turned around and left within minutes because they said they didn't want to risk getting caught there. By June of 2000, Timothy Obregon had been living in Baldwin Park for about 30 years. He wasn't in a gang. Around 10 p.m. on June 13th, Timothy got a call from a friend of his, Richard Robles. Richard was part of the Eastside Bolen Parque gang and lived less than a block away from Timothy. He asked Timothy if he could give a ride to a couple of his homeboys. At first, Timothy said no, because his girlfriend Alicia Garcia was on her way over. But when Richard offered him $40, Timothy agreed and decided to take his mother's great Nissan. Not long after, Richard showed up at Timothy's place with Joseph and Oswaldo. Alicia sat in the passenger seat next to Timothy, and in the back seat, Joseph sat directly behind Timothy, while Oswaldo sat behind Alicia. The car ride was quiet, which made Timothy uncomfortable. Eventually, Alicia broke the silence and asked how long the trip was going to take. Then out of nowhere, Timothy heard a popping sound and saw bullet holes in the windshield. Alicia started squirming in her seat and started saying, "Stop shooting me." When Timothy looked over, she was covered in blood. He turned to the back seat and saw Oswaldo putting another magazine in his gun and pointing it right at Alicia's head. Before Oswaldo could fire again, Joseph grabbed the gun out of his hands, telling him not to shoot anymore. Alicia was sobbing, blood pouring down her face, saying, "He shot me, and I'm dying." In a panic, Timothy started swerving on the road, but Joseph pressed something cold against the back of his neck and said, "Better drive straight, motherfucker, or I'll shoot you with this 9. Joseph then started telling Timothy where to go, eventually driving through a rural area surrounded by cornfields. Joseph leaned forward and asked him, "Do you know me?" Timothy replied, "No, I don't know you." Timothy then told Joseph that he'll tell the cops that they were carjacked. Alicia, who was terrified, whispered to him, "They're going to kill us, Tim. Don't you see? They're going to kill us and take off in the car." Terrified that her words might provoke them, Timothy yelled at her to be quiet. Then Joseph told Timothy he'd let them go so they could find somewhere to get Alicia help. Eventually, they pulled into a residential neighborhood, and before letting the couple go, Joseph demanded money, so Timothy handed over a $20 bill. Then Joseph told him, "Get your girl out of the car." Timothy then lifted her out of the seat and gently laid her on the sidewalk. Joseph and Oswaldo then sped off in the gray Nissan. Timothy sprinted into a nearby Circle K and dialed 911. Paramedics arrived quickly and saw that Alicia was shot twice, once in the chin and once in the chest. At first, Timothy was terrified of retaliation, so he told the police they were carjacked. A few hours later, around 3 a.m., Baldwin Park officer Johnny Patino responded to a call about a burning car in nearby El Monte. When investigators checked the plates, they confirmed that it was Timothy's mother's gray Nissan. On the night of June 18, 2000, just before midnight, Katrina Barber was sitting in front of her mom's house in a stolen Toyota Corolla when Joseph and Oswaldo showed up. They asked her for a ride and she agreed. The three then decided to head out to Alhambra, where the Corolla broke down. Katrina then stole a white Toyota Cressida. From there, they drove to Joseph's mom's house in Hemet, arriving around 3 a.m. They stayed the night and left the next morning. The trio then headed to La Puente to crash at their friend Luis Reyes's house, where they started using meth. Luis was also Eastside Bolen Parque. Later, they split into two cars. Katrina drove Joseph in the stolen Cressida, while Luis took Oswaldo in his charcoal gray Monte Carlo. That night, Katrina and Joseph watched Luis pull up next to another car in a hotel parking lot. Katrina parked a few spaces away and noticed that the other car looked suspicious. She thought it might be an undercover cop car, and Joseph thought it looked like an FBI car. Luis seemed to be talking to the people inside, maybe even handing them something. The vibe was tense, but nothing happened, and they all left soon after. Somewhere along the freeway, Katrina lost sight of Luis and Oswaldo's car. As Katrina and Joseph drove back toward Baldwin Park, they passed a group of young men sitting on a wall outside a house on Leadford St, which was claimed by the Eastside Bolen Parque. A Cadillac and a Camaro were in the driveway, with a Honda parked by the curb. Joseph asked if Katrina knew them. She said no. He then told her to flip a bitch and turn back around. She did, and drove back to where the young men were sitting. By then, Luis and Oswaldo caught up in the Monte Carlo. The young men sitting on the wall were Robert Perez, George Flores Art Martinez, and Joe Mayorkin. George wasn't in a gang, but two of his friends were members of the 22nd Street Gang. He had several tattoos, two of which said Brown Pride and 22. None of them were armed, although Art had a bag of guns they used earlier that day at a shooting range. Robert noticed the Monte Carlo right away. His brother-in-law was killed on that same street back in 1997, so he always watched his back. He saw the Monte Carlo pass, circle back, and stop. He told the others to go inside. Oswaldo then jumped out of the Monte Carlo with a black pistol. George tried to calm things down, saying nobody was disrespecting them or their neighborhood, but Oswaldo started shooting anyway. Robert then dove behind the Camaro to take cover. Joseph pulled out an AK-47 and started shooting from inside the car. Then he handed Katrina a .22 caliber pistol and told her to start shooting too. She fired 3 or 4 rounds. As the car sped away, Joseph and Oswaldo kept firing from the car. Joe was shot twice as he was trying to open the door, once in the right arm and once in the left thigh. He survived, and detectives later recovered a bullet from his body. George was shot twice in the back, and both were fatal. The cinder block wall out front was riddled with bullet holes. The house itself was struck, and every car out front had multiple bullet holes. Investigators recovered 14 9mm casings near the Camaro and 16 rifle casings behind the Honda. There was no evidence anyone from the house shot back. As they sped away, Katrina begged Joseph to take her home. He told her she couldn't go yet, but that Luis would drop her off later. She followed the Monte Carlo, but at some point, the stolen Cressida began to shake and mess up. Katrina pulled over, and so did the Monte Carlo. While Katrina was gathering her things, she suddenly heard gunshots coming from the Monte Carlo. She looked over and saw Oswaldo shooting Luis. Joseph ran to the Monte Carlo, and he and Oswaldo dragged Luis out of the driver's seat. Luis was still alive, choking and gagging on his own blood. Katrina, Joseph, and Oswaldo jumped into the Monte Carlo. When Katrina said she couldn't drive the car because Luis's leg was caught in the open door of the car, Joseph told her to just run him over. They all eventually went to Joseph's mom's place. Joseph wouldn't let Katrina leave, so she was stuck there for the next 3 or 4 days. During that time, Joseph's mom told him she wanted the guns out of her house and threatened to sell them. He told her that he will kill her if she did that. At one point, Katrina asked if Joseph planned to kill her too. He looked her in the eye and said, "If I wanted to kill you, I'd take you out back, shoot you, throw you in the trunk and dump you in the hills. Nobody would ever know." When she nervously said, "Your mom would know," Joseph told her that his mom won't care because she already knew that he killed Vego. The day after the shooting, around 2 p.m., a man named Andrew Quiroz was driving his van when he saw a man lying face down on the roadside. It was Luis Reyes. His shirt was soaked with blood, and he was barely breathing and making faint gurgling sounds. Paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, but Luis didn't make it. When detectives arrived at the scene, the stolen white Cressida was still parked near Luis's body. Investigators found a 9mm casing by the side of the road, a bullet on the road near the body, and fresh tire tracks. When the coroner turned Luis's body over, a bullet literally fell out of his back onto the street. Another casing was found underneath him. Inside the Cressida, police found a .22 caliber casing on the front floorboard, another behind the rear headrest, and 3 rifle casings. They also found Oswaldo's fingerprints in the car. A car payment receipt from Luis's wallet led investigators to the Monte Carlo. The autopsy showed that Luis was shot 19 times. Some were fired from as close as 2 feet away. He was shot in the chest, neck, arms, heart, and lungs. Detectives later concluded that Luis's murder wasn't random. Rumors were spreading that he was cooperating with police. Robert Perez eventually picked Oswaldo out of a photo lineup as one of the shooters on Leadford Street. Katrina Barber was eventually convicted of shooting at an inhabited dwelling house for the Leadford Street shootings. On the night of June 24th, just 5 days after the murder of George Flores and Luis Reyes, Karina Renteria, Joseph's girlfriend, met up with him and Oswaldo at her sister's house. They planned to go out that night. Karina drove her purple Honda Civic, and Joseph was in the passenger seat. Oswaldo followed them in Luis's Monte Carlo. Their first stop was a 7-Eleven in Bloomington. Karina waited in the car while the 2 men went inside to grab drinks. Around 10:30 p.m., Andrew Putney, a reserve deputy with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, was driving his white Chevy Tahoe patrol car. Suddenly, the Monte Carlo came speeding out of the 7-Eleven parking lot, cutting right across his lane and nearly causing a collision. The deputy started following Oswaldo, and after running the license plates, he learned the car was stolen and that its occupants were considered armed and dangerous. Meanwhile, Karina, who was still in the 7-Eleven parking lot, saw the sheriff's SUV following Oswaldo. With Joseph in the car too, she pulled out and followed them, staying about 2 cars behind. Oswaldo got on the I-10 freeway and started speeding even more, weaving in and out of lanes. Oswaldo suddenly swerved across traffic, cutting in front of a semi-truck, and darted off an exit ramp. The move was so sudden that Putney couldn't follow. He radioed dispatch, reporting that he lost sight of the stolen Monte Carlo. That's when Joseph told Karina to speed up, and as they pulled up next to the deputy's Tahoe, Joseph leaned out the passenger window and started shooting. At first, Putney thought he was hearing a car backfire, but then realized that it was actually a gun. His patrol car was hit 8 times. He tried to follow the car, but eventually had to pull over. The couple then headed to his mother's home where Oswaldo was already waiting. Oswaldo said the Monte Carlo was too hot and decided to burn the car. Joseph's mom and Karina then went to a gas station and filled up a gas tank. The 4 of them then drove in 2 separate cars to an isolated area, and Joseph and Oswaldo burned the Monte Carlo. The next day, Karina confided in a coworker and told him about what happened, and the sheriff's department contacted her shortly after. When detectives interviewed her, Karina cooperated and even gave them Joseph's pager number. She was later charged as an accessory to arson and pled guilty. It was just before midnight on July 3, 2000, when dispatch called in about a suspect tied to multiple homicides. He was spotted using a payphone at the Santa Monica Pier near the Playland Arcade. Police officers with the K9 unit showed up and spotted Joseph and Oswaldo about 30 yards away. When the 2 men saw the officers, Joseph kept walking forward towards the officers, but Oswaldo ducked into the arcade. Officer Leyva approached Joseph, trying to talk to him. As another officer started patting him down, Joseph tried running away, and a scuffle broke out. Officer Martinez lunged at him, tackling him to the wooden boards of the pier. Officer Von Aken released his police dog, which clamped down hard on Joseph's leg until they could get him cuffed. When they searched him, they found a fully loaded AP-9 semi-automatic pistol tucked into his waistband. After Joseph was taken to the hospital, the officer who was transporting him saw him reaching towards his waistband and trying to pull his pants higher. When Joseph started reaching into his pocket, the officer grabbed his arm and stopped him. After patting him down, he pulled out a loaded Colt .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol out of his pocket. Meanwhile, at the arcade, the employees started locking the front doors and leaving the back door as the only exit, trapping Oswaldo inside. Officers covered the front and back entrances. Oswaldo had a gun, which caused the people inside the arcade to panic. He ended up taking a woman named Kathy Yang hostage. He wrapped one arm tight around her neck while holding a gun in the other, while shooting towards the directions of the officers using her as a human shield. The officers couldn't take a shot at him because they would risk Kathy getting hit because she was too close to him. Oswaldo shot at some pillars where two officers were hiding. In the middle of the gunfire, Officer Christina Correa screamed, "I've been hit." She was shot in her left arm. At some point, a man suddenly bolted out of the arcade. Officers Hurt and Wong thought it was Oswaldo trying to escape. Hurt raised his shotgun and shouted for the man to stop and fired. But at that very moment, Hurt felt a jolt of electricity going through his leg. He looked down and realized he was shot himself. His shot missed that man who fled from the arcade, who turned out to be a terrified civilian who happened to look like Oswaldo. Officer Wong was also shot in the hip as he was running toward the civilian. Inside the arcade, Jing Huali was shot in the left leg. Oswaldo ordered the people inside to move the arcade machines around him to create some sort of a barricade and told them to sit around him. At one point, he made a man reload his magazine for him. Oswaldo held the people inside the arcade hostage for nearly 5 hours. He eventually told the hostages that he didn't feel right holding them there, and he ended up releasing them. After everyone was released, Oswaldo walked out and surrendered. Inside the arcade, investigators found 12 spent shell casings and 3 bullet fragments, all matching a 9mm Ruger semi-automatic pistol that was tucked behind one of the arcade machines. They also recovered 3 magazines. In total, 6 people were wounded during the Santa Monica Pier standoff. Forensics showed that every single bullet that wasn't fired by police during the Santa Monica Pier shootout came from the gun that was hidden inside the arcade. That Ruger was the same weapon used in the Leadford St shooting, the Luis Reyes murder, and Deputy Andrew Putney's shooting. A 9mm shell casing found at Paul Ponce's murder scene was fired from the pistol taken off Joseph when he was arrested at the pier, and a .22 caliber cartridge found inside Paul's home matched a .22 caliber cartridge from the Luis Reyes murder scene. During one of his recorded interviews, Joseph opened up to prosecutor Darren Levine, and the things he said were chilling. Talking about the bicycle shooting, Joseph admitted that he was the shooter and Oswaldo was driving because, quote, "I don't like driving. If I drive, how do I shoot?" Then he bragged, saying that he and Oswaldo, quote, did more murders than he would even realize. When the prosecutor brought up the deputy's shooting, he joked that the gunman was a good shot. Joseph laughed and said, "Yeah, it's hard when both cars are moving and one's turning." Then Joseph turned his attention to Katrina Barber, who was going to testify against him and Oswaldo. He called her a stupid broad, and that he wanted to tell her that they could have easily killed her, and that she's in jail because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. Joseph also asked the prosecutor to see the autopsy photos. He said, quote, "I want the autopsies. Hey, I look at them all day. Anything with bullet holes. I want to see where the holes run in, where the bullet enters." Joseph also described the murder of Paul Pon in disturbing detail, down to what Paul was wearing. He also admitted that they hurt some people for no reason. When they were talking about the Santa Monica Pier shootout, Oswaldo told them that the police were lucky that night because he had a fully automatic AK-47 with a drum that night. When an investigator asked both men about what their mission was, Oswaldo said, quote, "To kill as many people as I could, cops included." They also bragged about the times they gave police officers a pass. They mentioned that one time they saw an officer outside a nursery and waited for him to come out with 2 AKs, but in the end they changed their mind and decided not to kill him. Prosecutor Darren Levine asked Joseph about the small pistol he had at the hospital after he was arrested, and Joseph admitted that he was going to shoot a cop with it. On November 2, 2001, inside the high-security wing of the Los Angeles County Jail, deputies Fred Jimenez and Richard Thompson were preparing to move a group of inmates to the visiting area. Among the 5 inmates lined up were Joseph, Oswaldo, and another inmate named Steve Matson. Because this was a maximum security unit, inmates weren't allowed to leave their cells unless they were chained around the waist with their wrist locked into the waist chain and cuffed tightly behind their backs. Steve was at the front of the line, while Joseph and Oswaldo were in the back. As the group started to move, the deputies had no idea that both Joseph and Oswaldo managed to slip out of their restraints. Steve, who was still cuffed, was attacked by both men. They started punching and kicking him, and eventually took out their shanks and started stabbing him over and over again, on his sides, arms, and stomach. The attack went on for 30 seconds to a minute before Deputy Jimenez pepper sprayed them. Steve was stabbed 5 times in the stomach and had several deep wounds across his shoulder. He was rushed to the hospital and treated for his injuries. By the time the case finally went to trial, Joseph Conrad Flores and Oswaldo Amezcua had a mountain of charges. Their indictments listed 47 separate counts, each with special circumstances, gang allegations, and enhancements. When the verdicts finally came in, the jury found both men not guilty of the murder of Paul Pon, and they also found Joseph not guilty of being a felon in possession of a firearm in that count. However, both Joseph and Oswaldo were convicted of 4 first-degree murders: the murder of George Flores, the murder of Luis Reyes, the murder of John Diaz, and the murder of Arturo Madreal. Joseph was also found guilty of the attempted murders of Joe Mayorkin, Robert Perez, Art Martinez, Deputy Andrew Putney, and Fernando Gutierrez. Oswaldo was convicted of the same attempted murders, except Deputy Andrew Putney's. He was also convicted of 7 counts of attempted murders tied to the Santa Monica Pier hostage incident. Joseph was also found guilty of shooting at an inhabited dwelling and 5 counts of being a felon in possession of a firearm. He was also found guilty of assault on a peace officer with a semi-automatic weapon, arson, custodial possession of a weapon, and that he was previously convicted of 2 counts of robbery. Oswaldo was also convicted of 1 count of shooting at an inhabited dwelling, 3 counts of possession of a firearm by a felon, 1 count of robbery, 1 count of arson, 2 counts of assault with a semi-automatic weapon, 6 counts of false imprisonment of a hostage, and 1 count of custodial possession of a weapon. The jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision on a few charges: the attempted murder of Steve Matson, possession of shanks inside the jail, and the attempted murder of Paul Gonzalez. The court declared a mistrial on those counts. Multiple special circumstances, enhancements, and gang allegations were found true in some counts. Both Joseph Conrad Flores and Oswaldo Amezcua were sentenced to death. Thank you for watching.